This is the second video in the Annelid series, Annelids 2, and we left off with this on the last video with this diagram, the generalized annelid worm. And now we're going to go through and start looking at a few of the specializations of some of the parts of these worms that are different between the different species. Okay, so here's your typical polychaete. And you'll always recognize it as a polychaete, again, because it's got all of these segments. And just like we were talking about in the last video, the last one's a little bit different, but all of these other ones are just carbon copies of each other, except for these, they're tapering off at the towards the growth zone. So they need to grow to get as big as the ones up at the front. And you can see the Parapodia right here, and the little setae, sometimes called chaetae, and the last two segments, the one just before the head and the head, or the prostomium, are different. This one doesn't have the Parapodia and setae. This one has the appendages that show cephalization and help this thing sense the world that's around it. Now you can see that this one's a predator. It's got these big jaws and teeth interior, and then a pharynx, which is for swallowing, and these tentacles and the eye spots, and here are the palps up here to help this thing to sense the world around itself. Now you can see the palps here are at the very end of it in this picture, but then way back here, not at the end in this picture, and that's because this pharynx is something that they can avert out, so it actually goes shooting forward to grab hold of the prey. Okay. So the modifications to the tentacles and the palps are pretty much what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the animals in this class. Parapodia, just to sharpen up this definition, Parapodia is the paired lateral appendages. Those are those little arms that stick off of each segment, and they're muscular, so they use those to propel them forward, digging, burrowing, swimming, also for defense, because sometimes they're quite spiky. And then the spikes will be the setae or the chaetae, and that's what polychaete means, many hairs. And then the chaetae are hairs on each segment, increasing traction with the substratum to aid burrowing, but also for other purposes, depending on how they're shaped. And you can see here, this is a micrograph of setae. These things are, quite sharp, and obviously would give a lot of purchase if this thing was trying to propel itself forward on soft sediment. All right, they've got a closed blood vascular system. This is an offshoot of the mesoderm, like we were talking about before. And so what are the functions of this blood vascular system that are different from the smallish animals that we've been looking at in the past? Well, they remove waste, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen and other metabolites, just like in ours, and just like in our blood system. They take stuff to the kidneys to be filtered out, and they also bring in oxygen. Now, worms don't have kidneys. What they do is the blood passes close to the skin, and then the oxygen is just absorbed in through the skin, and the wastes are diffused out through the skin. Okay. So how does it get moved around? Well, they've got hearts. Okay. And okay, there we go. There's the answer to that we just covered in the last slide. Another feature of polychaetes, and pretty much all of the annelids, is incredible powers of regeneration. If you remember this guy from the second or the third Terminator movie, This is the one where it might have been the second. Anyway, he'd been blown. This thing had been blown to lots and lots of bits after getting frozen, and all the bits came back together, and he regenerated himself. So polychaetes are like that. They're able to regenerate body parts pretty easily if something is bitten off, and even the head can be bitten off. And if there are enough energy reserves in the rest of that body to regrow that animal or regrow that body part while the animal can't feed, then it will. So this is the age-old question: if you cut an earthworm in two, will both sides survive and grow into new worms? Not necessarily. It just depends on whether they have enough energy reserves to be able to heal themselves while they're waiting to be able to feed. Okay, loads and loads of different types of reproduction. So they're sometimes dioecious, which means that they have separate male and female adult forms, and sometimes they're hermaphrodites. Okay, which is a typical earthworm is an hermaphrodite, and they exhibit broadcast spawning, copulation, and epitoky. All right, so this is the first. This is one of the first phylum that we've seen where copulation is the norm, or can be the norm. Okay, and epitoky we'll discuss in a little bit. And sometimes you find budding. Okay, and here's what happens with budding. They've got new individuals that just grow from the growth zone, and then they just break off. Alright, and here's a nice picture of what that looks like. Okay, so the individuals are just growing out of the rear end of the polychaete worm, and when the conditions are right, they'll just break off and be brand new polychaete worms. Generally, when the conditions are right, means when there's a lot of food, so that these things can quickly reproduce and take advantage of that food resource, and that means that they are passing on lots more copies of their genes faster than they could produce larvae that would that food resource might be gone by the time they produced a larva that grows up into an adult. So this way, these things are pretty much ready to feed, grow very quickly, and then pass on more copies of themselves, which, as we know from evolutionary theory, is the whole reason for organisms to be alive, is to pass on copies of themselves. Now, epitoky is an interesting one, and often seen in the tropics. Okay, but I've seen big spawning events of epitokes down at the Bridge Marina when we've been going out on Naukiwa. And epitoky spawning is when the body or the posterior segments, so the back end of it, very much like this. Okay, they'll grow off little segments like this. They get modified into essentially a baby making factory, a gamete carrying machine. And the Parapodia grow and grow and grow, so they get really big. And when the conditions are favorable for successful spawning, the worm, those segments that will break off, swim to the surface using those bigger Parapodia. And here's a nice picture of it. Okay, big Parapodia here with paddles. They look like paddles. They're good for swimming. And they'll all gather together. So when they get to the surface, there'll be heaps of these things together, and that's a very good way for the eggs and sperm to find each other. And then the eggs and sperm are released, or these things, and some of them will actually just these things will just break open, and the eggs and sperm will be released that way. So they're just like essentially an egg or sperm bomb that goes to the surface. These things swim around trying to find each other. And you can see these long sensory things, very much like a Luna moth, where these things are probably have a sensory function to try to find other other annelid worms so that they maximize the chance of their eggs and sperm finding each other. And this is called, these things are netted, and these things are called caviar of the Pacific. This picture looks really gross, but if you think about it, we eat lots and lots of eggs. Like if you think about the part of quinoa that we eat, it's eggs and it's the eggs and the sperm. And we love our chicken eggs, and caviar is fish eggs, and also eggs are just packed full of nutrition, and so we tend to really like these things, and these are a delicacy in the Pacific. Okay, so feeding strategies for annelid worms. All right, so hunting carnivores will usually have jaws. Well, they pretty much always have jaws. They have several pairs of eyes, and they crawl around the bottom, and you can find loads of these in the estuaries around here, but just turn over rocks and you'll find hunting polychaetes. And they may have jaws to capture the prey, or they may just puncture the prey and suck out their vital fluids. And they can be amazing predators. And here's Exhibit A. Alright, so this thing caught this fish. This is obviously a tropical one because we can see this Cnidarian theca, alright, or this is a coral head with a little bit of sponge growing over the top in certain areas. But this bristle worm, here the Parapodia and setae, right, caught this fish and he's consuming it. So they can be quite vicious predators. And sometimes, and like we were talking about before, and this is really common with the ones that you find in the estuary here is the head, the prostomium, but the pharynx will come shooting out to grab the prey. And if you pick one up and annoy it, you'll be able to see the pharynx come out. And maybe I'll show that to you at Fidiana if I can, if we're together. Alright, here are some of the worm jaws that you'll see, polychaete worm jaws. And generally these are used to break up prey, catch prey, or macerate it. Alright. Deposit feeding is common among the polychaetes. Okay, so I've got a picture of this thing which is not a polychaete worm. It's a basking shark. Alright, and it is just cruising through the water, just eating whatever comes in front of it that it strains out. So that's a good analogy because deposit feeders often, especially non-selective deposit feeders, will just cruise through the sediment eating any old dirt that comes into their mouth, and then they digest out the bacteria and fungus and any other digestible organic material that is within that sediment that they've eaten. So they eat any old dirt. No mechanism for selecting one size particle over another, which is non-selective deposit feeding. Some there might be selective deposit feeding, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And some live in burrows and rely on fresh organic matter falling into those burrows, like these holes that they build. And so if they're not digging their way through the sediment, they may have very reduced Parapodia and setae. And sometimes they even build their own little tubes that they live in, and these are the tube worms that you'll see. Okay, so here we go. Here's Arenicola. This is an Arenicola worm, and it's got this little burrow that it digs, and organic material will just sort of pile up in here, and they eat what essentially falls down in here. And so this one is a deposit feeder. Okay, and you'll find that at certain times of the tide, you can walk around and you'll see that there are loads and loads of these, massive amounts of these things in the sediment because you can see the little poo piles. So you see the little piles that are on the surface, and you can see how many, the huge amount of these worms that live in that area. And these things are very important for bringing oxygen and oxygenated water down into the anoxic zone down here, where we'll learn a little bit more about that. But this area, all the oxygen is used up by bacteria in the sediments, and these things can bring it down, and they create a lot of holes and networks for other organisms to move down into the sediment. Okay. Some of these will make distinctive burrows that you can see, and you'll see loads of these if you go to the beach and you dive off of the beach. You just go out past the surf and just dive, take a tank down, just head straight out past the breakers and start looking around, and you'll find an amazing variety of life. But one of them will be all these little tubes, and you try to follow one down and see what's down there, and it seems like you can never really reach the bottom of the tube. They'll go down 20, 30 centimeters quite easily into the sand. And you can still see that this is an annelid worm because of the Parapodia and setae and the paired appendages and the segments on these things. Same with this Arenocola. There's a setae here, all the segments. Okay, they're quite a bit more reduced in these ones because they don't need them for much more than holding on to the sides of these burrows. And so these things will sit in this tube and then filter feed out of the water column. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, another type of deposit feeding is selective deposit feeding, and these things have grooved tentacles that draw in certain size particles. The small particles have a much greater surface area, and when these things are digesting bacteria, there's a little biofilm that lives on each of the particles. So if you ingest small particles, you'll actually get more food. That's not all that important for you to know, but it sort of tells you the reasoning behind why they might eat smaller size particles. And these cilia, another ciliated surface within the grooves, can move the particles along the tentacle, and then they can move them towards or away from the mouth. So let's have a look at some of these. So this is what you're going to see. There again, you can tell that it's an annelid worm because of the segments and the little Parapodia on the side, and this one's got a little bit more bristly Parapodia. But they build these little burrows, these little tubes, by sticking together with mucus. Really, almost anything that is around them in the sand or in the sediment. Might be little bits of shell and things like that. Okay, and you'll find that that's a habitat for a lot of other organisms that live on these tube worms. And you can see the little tentacles zooming around all over the surface. Alright, so here's another picture of what that spaghetti worm burrow might look like. And here's another picture of what the tentacles would look like. This would be taken at night. Normally we see these quite often underneath rocks or in the sort of cracks on a rocky reef or near the, and well, all over the place, but really you'll find them quite in substantial numbers near where the rocky reef peters out into the sand. And if you touch these tentacles, they will withdraw. You can get these things, and I recommend you try this. If you see one of these things, touch the tentacles and watch as they all withdraw into this tube, like a bunch of pieces of spaghetti being taken in. Okay, and here's one outside of its burrow. All right, so you can see all the little tentacles and these gills All right, so some of them actually have these gills, but these are for or for oxygen exchange and waste exchange at the water column. But you can also see that this is bilaterally symmetrical by looking at, say, the antenna and this little some of these projections that are the same on both sides. And then you look right down the center, and you'll see of course the segments and the Parapodia and setae on both sides. Okay, some of these worms also use the strategy of suspension feeding, and these are some of the prettier of these annelid worms, the polychaetes. So fan worms, Christmas tree worms, these things have something that are called radioles. They look a bit feathery. They're covered with cilia, again, another ciliated surface, to capture, sort, and transport food particles. So here is a nice picture of the radioles of a Christmas tree worm. And you'll see this little cap right here. These things, if you come up to a Christmas tree worm while you're diving, or any fan worm, and come up close to it, try to go ahead and grab it and see how quickly this thing withdraws. It'll be lightning fast, and then they can pull this little trap door over the entrance to their burrow. This is called an operculum, just like we'll see in mollusks, just like the cat's eye of a cat's eye shell. You know, the little part that goes, the little trapdoor part that goes over the entrance of the cat's eye shell. And so that is a protective cap that keeps anything from coming down into the burrow and trying to ferret it out and eat the worm. Now these things do get bitten off occasionally by fish, and so they can regenerate very well, as we know. But these ones are ciliated particles that move water through them, and then you can see what good strainers they'd be for capturing food particles out of the water. Here is this one you can tell is on a coral polyp, all right, on a theca. And, well, not a coral polyp, more of a coral head. Each one of these would have a coral polyp in it, okay, but it's a coral head. Now this one is more of a local, it's a fan worm, all right, and you can see again how useful these things would be for straining particles of food out of the water. But when we look at it, we can tell that it's an annelid worm because of the little setae here, paired, and all of the segments. Here's a beautiful fan worm. Okay, another local one. A geezer took this picture. And here is this fan worm withdrawn, or feather duster worm, sorry. This feather duster worm is withdrawn into its tube here. And you can see another one here, and another tube worm tube here. Once you start looking around on the reefs, you'll see tube worms absolutely everywhere. Okay, some species with jaws are not predators. Some use their jaws to macerate drifting macroalgae. So they catch this, but they'll catch large particles of kelp, really, macroalgae, or algae that you can see without the aid of a microscope, and so they are big pieces of kelp, and they just chew those up. Those are the vegetarians. Other ones, rather than catching food with things like the feathery radioles, they'll just have a big mucus bubble, and then whatever organic particles stick to it, they eat when they ingest that whole mucus bubble. Okay, and that's about everything you need to know for annelids for this video series.